Hi, and welcome to the Raw Heart and Soul podcast. This morning, I have on my show Glenn Oslin, and this is the first time I've met Glenn. He came via a referral from another friend who I've had on here, Christopher Jones. So, welcome to the show, Glenn.
Thank you, Tanya. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this because, yeah, I think we've got a lot in common, but I think there's some interesting questions in here that I want to hear your perspective on from what I've researched about you.
Uh-oh. Okay.
People
Sounds
say
good.
that. What is the job that you do right now? So I know that you're a podcaster, but give us a bit of background about what it is you do for work.
So I work for a dentist who makes oral appliances for people who suffer from sleep apnea.
Mm. So you mentioned just a few minutes ago you're out on the road, so you're a salesman.
Yeah, I do. I'm doing sales right now. I'm doing operations management. It's a small company, a startup. We're just getting it off the ground. So yeah,
Cool.
that's
And
what I
so
do.
and so the podcasting is like kind of like a hobby.
Yeah, well, I've been podcasting as a hobby for about 10 years. I did it as a freelancer for a couple of years. I had a few clients and then that went away. And so I had to go find something else to do.
Mm. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you were raised, because I from my research, you were a Mormon. You're not a Mormon now.
Right. Well, yeah. Yeah. So I was raised as a Mormon. I'm no longer a believing Mormon or attending church or anything like that. I haven't resigned. A lot of Mormons who uh, aren't Mormon anymore, they resign. They have their names removed from the record of the church. I've never gone to that extreme with it. But yeah, so I've been doing a podcast since 2012 called Infants on Thrones, which I started with five friends of mine, all kind of disgruntled Mormons coming out of that culture, that belief system. And we started off pretty rowdy and mostly atheist leaning. And yeah, really kind of satirically taking shots at belief and faith. And, it was kind of a way for us to detach from those belief systems that were so much a part of who we were. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how much you know about Mormonism,
No,
but
I was going to ask you that. So
yeah,
I was raised in a Catholic family, and my immediate family we were Catholics. We used to go to church
yeah,
up until. So then one of my extended family became very heavily involved in the Catholic Church and actually started his own kind of sect cult away as part of the Catholic Church, but a side part of it. So from that
oh,
point on,
interesting.
yeah, really interesting. So from that point on, we were still Catholic and we still went to Catholic schools, and I think I was about 9 when that happened. But as I look back now in my childhood, even though my mum and dad kind of said, "Oh, we're not going to go to church because this particular family member was really full on,"
Yeah,
we still had all of those values, and we still had. And now that I can unpack my programming as an adult,
yeah,
so much of it was subliminal, and not even from my parents' perspective, but as a like my extended family.
sure.
So, yeah, I'm interested to learn about the difference between Catholics and Mormons, because I really don't have much of a background on it.
Well, I think some of the similarities that you'd find, I mean, Catholicism obviously is a lot older, more depth of tradition there. But it's, if you say that you're Catholic, that extends to more than just your belief system, right? I mean, it's kind of a culture and a way of life. And Mormonism is very much like that as well. It's a much younger religion,
Yeah.
but it's so pervasive. It's not just going to church for a couple of hours every Sunday. It's a lifestyle and a belief system and interacting with other Mormons, and it forms a subculture all of its own, and which I understand Catholicism is a culture as much as it is a religion,
Mm.
as well. So so yeah, that and my childhood growing up Mormon, I really liked it. I had a lot of friends. I enjoyed the structure. I enjoyed, there were things I didn't enjoy where like my mom would tell me maybe an hour before it was time to go to church, "Oh, you're going to be performing today. You're going to be singing in front of the congregation." Like, really?
Oh wow.
So she'd put me up on the stand, but that was something that her parents had done to her,
Yeah.
or for her or with her, or however you want to look at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, uh, being born Mormon, and each one of my great grandparents were also born Mormon. So it's like think I'm a seventh generation Mormon, and yeah, just very, very deep roots growing up in Arizona in a fairly large Mormon community, all of my extended family. It was just a very pervasive part.
That was life as you
that
knew
was it. That was it. Yeah.
No drinking?
No.
No smoking, no caffeine?
No. Well, the no caffeine thing, some people, some Mormons are more strict on that than others. We drank Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. But no coffee, no tea, which seemed kind of strange because when I turned 19 years old, I went on a Mormon mission to Japan. So I was 2 years in Japan, where coffee and especially tea are very, very big.
Very much a part of the culture.
Very much a part of the culture. And so to have to tell people that's bad, it just didn't really make a lot of sense. Though, how could this be bad?
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And in terms of, and I think this is the thing that I have found with differences between the Catholic religion and other religions, is that they're more accepting, or they're completely not accepting of multiple wives in a family and that sort of thing. So did Mormons have multiple wives? Is that like
that there? I mean, that definitely is part of Mormon history for sure. Where there was polygamy, and it was even at one point, but I mean, we're talking about in the late 1800s, like 1850s to maybe 1910, 1912, is about the span of polygamy being part of mainstream Mormonism. And it was one of the highest ordinances in Mormonism, like being baptized is required to enter heaven, and being sealed to multiple wives was also seen as one of these ordinances that's required to go to the highest degree of heaven.
So you could get in, but not to the level that someone else who had multiple wives could.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It definitely had this hierarchical structure on the afterlife, which was one of the things that I liked about Mormonism, that it wasn't, there's either a heaven or a hell that you go to. There wasn't really a hell, that there was this place called outer darkness, and outer darkness is where you would go if you just reject Jesus Christ and you reject faith. But if you don't reject that, then there's 3 different levels. You could go to the highest, celestial, or the terrestrial in the middle, or the telestial at the end. But even the telestial kingdom, being the lowest of those 3, was supposed to be so much better than this earth life. And even that was a heaven. And so I liked that and being raised to think that there are degrees of glory, is what it's called. There's degrees of glory in the afterlife, rather than black and white, either this or that. I think I really appreciate the impact that had on my mind.
So you think
programming that had on my mind? Yeah. I think now being much more open to accepting diversity and nuance. Now, I'm not saying that all Mormons are like that, but that's how I think that's how it impacts.
That's your experience of it. Yeah. It's really interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And to the polygamy question, I'll just finish that. So it ended in the early, like around 1910 or something like that. But then there were offshoots that said, this has been such an important part of the religion for so long that this is a false prophet who's telling us to discontinue this. And so those smaller groups and offshoots kept it alive. But there's still places where that's practiced today, but it's not part of mainstream Mormonism, and certainly wasn't anything that I was ever aware of, really, as I was growing up. I didn't become aware of this until I was much older.
Why do you think religions do that? Why do you think there are, like the Catholic Church, why are there offshoots like that? What's your thoughts around that?
Why are there offshoots of religions?
So like why will, like, say that, for example, they've evolved to thinking that it's not as common, but there are certain sections of it that still practice that. Like, why do people stray away from what is considered the original?
Well, I think it's because there's something that's really appealing about wherever they find um, something that's attractive to them. I think in the case of um, these polygamy offshoots of Mormonism, it's because they really felt like they've been told this is the right way to live over and over and over again, and then okay, now we're putting that away. We're going to do something different. And for some people, they'd formed such an identity around these practices, such an identity around these beliefs, and that could be a personal identity. It could be members of a group, and so if you're really attached to some of these ideas, and then the ideas shift, it's not always easy to just shift with them. So I think it has to do with personal identity, group identity, and just really where people feel the most comfortable. And everybody's so different.
Yeah.
Everybody's so different that you're going to have things that are appealing to you, little bits and pieces here, little bits and pieces there, and you just kind of go where it feels the most comfortable, I think.
So when you shifted away from that, or I know in your notes to me you said that you suddenly realized that you were more atheist.
Yeah, that took a while. Yeah, and that was
Yeah.
a surprise when I found out that so what happened with me, Tanya, I served my mission in Japan for 2 years, and I came back, and I was a college student at Brigham Young University, which is a Mormon-owned university in Provo, Utah. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for a living. And I I went to a professor and asked him his advice, and he said, "Go to the library and look through the card catalog." You remember the card catalog before?
Yeah, I
You
love.
know?
Yeah, I'm a big
You
library
know,
fan. Yes.
right. And he's going, so look through the little
Wow.
cards in the card catalog, find books and titles that are interesting to you, and see what that tells you about like where you might want to go in life. And so I went and I checked out 3 books that day, and one was called From Scythia to Camelot, I think, and it was about the way that Camelot legend had migrated throughout Europe and taken on different elements of the story here and there, and it's kind of built as it migrated and moved through the continent. There was a book called The Legend of the City of Is, which was kind of like an Arthurian legend, but in Brittany and in France.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Unpublished Revelations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the official name of the Mormon Church. And it was all these kind of like legends and folklore that is outside of the mainstream teachings of the Mormon Church. And so I noticed that what all of those things had in common was this idea of folklore and tradition and legend and myth.
Yep.
So I got in touch with a folklore professor at Brigham Young University, and I worked with him for 2 years in his folklore archives. I cataloged missionary stories of different legends that missionaries tell each other.
Yeah.
And then I went to Indiana University to get a master's degree and a PhD in folklore and mythology. And as I was studying, and I focused on Mormons as a culture, as a folk group, we
Right.
called. And the closer I put my own beliefs and my own culture under a microscope and compared it with other cultures and other beliefs, the more I saw, okay, there's a lot of things that we're doing in common. There's this
Mm-hmm.
idea of sympathetic magic and contagious magic and homeopathic magic that Sir James Fraser wrote The Golden Bough talked about. And as I was reading that, I thought, oh, there's things that we do in Mormonism. We don't call it magic. We call it priesthood blessings, or we call it, something like this, but
Something
it's
different.
basically the same idea.
Yeah.
And so my literal belief in those things started falling away, and I saw them as like there's a value in ritual, there's a value in customs, there's a value in all these things, but it's different than what I thought before. It's not that God is saying this is what you need to do to get to heaven. It's more about groups of people saying here's what you need to do to interact with us and be acceptable members of society.
Yeah.
and so slowly my faith started to morph and change, and it got to a point probably in 2009, I was reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And in that book, he has this scale of agnostic probability from 1 to 7. And I read number 6 on that scale, which is a de facto atheist, which means that you're not 100% certain that there's no God, but you think it's highly improbable that he exists, or you at least live your life as if God does not exist. And I went, that's kind of where I am. I think that God is the story that people have told, and there's
Told themselves, yeah.
And you might find this interesting, and I'll stop talking a minute and let you ask me questions.
No, I'm loving this.
When I was a graduate student, I was teaching folklore classes to college students at Indiana University, and I used to do this belief survey where I would have about 30 questions and have every student in the class answer them. And it was things like, yes or no. Do you believe in a God? Do you believe in a devil? Do you believe in angels? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in hell? Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in aliens? Just all these kinds of things. And there were certain pairs that I expected that if somebody believed in God, then they would also believe in a devil, or if somebody believed in heaven, they would also believe in a hell, but it was this scatter shot all over the board. Like I did this class after class, year after year. I couldn't figure out any patterns. It was just like this hodgepodge of what people believed and what they didn't believe, which is morphing and changing all the time.
So what do you do with that information when you see that?
I think I started to appreciate the malleable nature of belief in humans more than I did before. And instead of being so rigidly attached to this is the right way, this is the wrong way, I said, look at all the different ways there are that people think this is the right way. And these are the way that all the elements of existence are lining up. And everybody has such a different view of it that I hadn't really recognized or appreciated before that.
I think you hit the nail on the head with when you say rigidity around their beliefs and their systems. And what I see, the deeper I get with my own studies on myself, the more I see in other people the things that they carry through life with them. And I see it in a physical as well as a metaphysical, because I coach in both realms. So physical manifests in the physical in so many ways, in like tight in the thoracic spine, rigid in their movement, but how it holds them back, like how that rigid thinking and not being open to being curious about where somebody else is coming from really is, it can mess people up because they get programmed or they get stuck in that way of thinking, and for them to admit that what they've lived and what they've believed their whole life might not be necessarily what they thought it was, not necessarily right or wrong. And to have to admit that means that part of their identity is shaken.
Yeah. And I see a lot of that rigidity now, kind of the same way that I see a cocoon for, a caterpillar that's changing into a butterfly. And there's this like rigid covering that protects it from the outside world. And until it's ready, it stays in there. And it might be kind of painful as you're breaking, you're pushing up against it to try to break out of it.
Yeah.
But then when you break out of it, you realize, oh, I'm a different thing than I was before. And of course, as soon as you get out of it, there's another cocoon just on the outside. The concentric layers of cocoons and rigidity as we're like growing out of whatever systems of belief we were raised in or have adopted. But yeah, so I understand like looking at that kind of rigidity as being a problem and a cause of suffering, and I think it is. But I don't really like labeling it as a problem that way, because it's so crucial for growth and development.
Yeah. So if someone's going through that journey, they're clearly going through that journey for a reason.
Yeah. And there's a benefit to it. And I don't ever want to be dismissive and say, and just do the Pollyanna, well, look at the good. I tend to do that. And people who are in the midst of suffering are like, wait until I'm done suffering to tell me the good part. I need to feel what I'm feeling and get through this right now.
Hold space for them and hold space for where they're at.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So where do you sit with your belief around God now?
Well, my belief around God now is, it's still kind of the same, that any story that anybody is ever telling about God, or any thought that I might think about God, is a symbol. And it's an imperfect symbol that's formed by a brain that has like severe limitations on what it's able to perceive of reality.
Mm.
And that, so I'm going to do a nod to Richard Dawkins again, because just like Richard Dawkins showed me that I was a de facto atheist, at least by the way he was defining that term, he also introduced this way for me to understand God that could go beyond the realm of symbols. He did an interview for a movie that Ben Stein did on intelligent design, and Ben Stein was asking him about the probability of God existing in the universe, or there being an intelligent designer, and where did life come from? How did life happen on this planet? And Richard Dawkins kept saying, we don't know. But if there was some kind of intelligent designer that seeded life on this planet, it would have had to have been maybe some civilization in a remote corner of the universe that advanced to a high level of technology through some kind of Darwinian evolution like we have here on this earth, and then, traveled the universe and seeded life on this planet, which isn't that dissimilar from the Mormon view of God that I was raised with, that God had evolved to the point of godhood, and that all of us as his children were deity in embryo, basically, that we're eternally progressing towards godhood. Mm-hmm. And so because that was my background, when I heard what Richard Dawkins was saying, I thought, okay, so maybe there could have been an advanced civilization, not necessarily that they evolved in the form of like humans, but maybe at the form of energy, something that we can't even really conceive of. And so I guess to answer your question, my view of God now, I think, is some kind of really undefinable energy. Maybe the closest I could come to it would say the energy that's in the quantum realm, that source energy that just like is everything that we see around us. That's why I wrote the book Bathing with God.
Yeah.
To explore this idea of God being source energy.
Yeah.
And friends of mine would say, why are you calling it God? Why that name?
Why that name? Why that label?
Yeah. And well, what else would you call it? What are the typical characteristics that we use when we talk about God? We talk about a creator. Yeah. We talk about omniscience, omnipotence, yeah. Omnipresent. And I think that this idea of source energy, at least the way that I understand it, is all of those things. Always, everywhere.
Yeah.
At all time.
Everything and nothing at once.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the nothing. Why the nothing?
I think because I think sometimes we look into, or we as humans, we look at what we can see, mm-hmm. and we classify the things that we can't see as not important or nothing, when in fact that's probably where more of the energy exists.
Okay.
That's the way I would describe that.
Sure. Yeah. Invisible.
Yeah. You're not even, well, I see it differently a lot more now, because I like the density. That's the way I would describe it. The density around us that we don't know, that we don't necessarily tap into unless we're really aware of it.
Okay.
Because
the empty space.
Yeah, the abyss. And we have that inside us as well as outside us, is what my belief of that is. That the space. And I think as humans, or looking from a human perspective, we see it as the gaps and the emptiness in between it. Whereas a lot lately, I'm seeing it as it's so full. There's so much more there than we even know about. I think, like, when you talk about the use of the brain and how much we can tap into, there's so much of it that we don't use. There's so much of the nothing, or of the outer, or of the abyss, that we don't allow ourselves to understand or comprehend, because it's frightening, and because it's scary, of that unknown.
Yeah. And because we really can't.
Unless you have that experience of being in those other realms, is what I'm talking about. And I described this, I think it was in an email last night to some of my clients, but it's kind of like I see things now where my life's going along, like, and this is the example I use. We were driving on the freeway on Sunday, my husband and one of our kids, and two kangaroos jumped across the freeway in front of us, two cars in front of us. And one of them, I actually only saw the very first one because it was on my side of the car and it was injured. And Andrew slammed the brakes on and warning lights and everything went off. It's kind of like they didn't jump out of anywhere that I saw. It's kind of like this, like a tear in the nothing or in the abyss that they kind of jumped through and into my life and into my world. They kind of, it's like this tear that happened and they jumped in. And then I'm left with, what do I do with that tear? Does that get closed back up again? Or do I learn from that experience and not to the point of where I'm like pulling every minuscule thing apart, but what did that mean in my life at that moment? And what does it mean going forward? And does that, it's like this, it's really hard to describe. It's like a tear in the ether that opens to let something in, to make you aware of it, or to bring you, to center you or bring you back to that moment. And then does it close up, or are you able to get back into that again when you choose to?
But when you're talking about the tear,
yeah,
are you talking about like the transition from going when the kangaroos were outside of your conscious awareness to when they were inside of your conscious
correct.
awareness? Okay,
that's exactly what I mean. Yeah,
gotcha.
You just put it in better words. Yeah, and because I'm learning more about how to get into that unconscious and get in and bring that into more of my conscious, because I want to know what's there. So I'm going to ask you a different question.
All right.
What do you feel about soul then? So I differentiate God from soul. I differentiate soul being the seed in which is inside of me that contains the blueprint of what I've come here to do. How do you feel about that word soul?
Yeah, I've been really interested in the word soul, and I still haven't settled on what I really think of it. But the way that I'm most comfortable of thinking about a soul is that it's kind of like a big clump of source energy that is constantly like morphing and changing, and like I don't think of myself as having a soul. I think of myself as being an extension of a soul, and that the soul that I'm a part of is also the soul of many other things, many other people. You know, that the souls are kind of this. I think in Bathing with God, I talk about them as like neighborhoods or something like that. That they're just kind of. I think ultimately it's all source energy, but there are different. I don't know, the way that I think of it. There's different clumps. I think really clump is the only word that kind of matches what you're picture thinking in my head when I'm thinking about it. Yeah. And that like multidimensional, not just in this three-dimensional space, but every place that there's existence, that soul is doing something in it and interacting with other souls in other ways. And maybe a simple way would be to think of like how my body has 2 arms and each arm has 5 fingers, and you know, so maybe like my torso is like a soul and my arm is an extension of that soul, and then the fingers are extensions of that.
Again,
maybe something kind of like that, but it's always changing, morphing. And I also think one of the hard things about talking about this is I really think that time, the way that we experience it, you know, we experience this moment to moment progression, like we're moving through time. But I think that Einstein was really onto it when he said all time exists all the time. And he talked about the relativity of time and time and space being part of the same thing. So that like I picture it as I don't even know how to describe it, but that everything already exists and we're just kind of like moving moment through it, making choices on what it becomes for us. But I think, I've been really influenced by theoretical physicists like Brian Greene, who talk about the possibility of multiple dimensions and multiple realities. And so I would think that a soul, God, would exist in all of those places and all of those things, and we're just like right here right now in this moment that we're in, making choices every day, and learning and growing with what's put in front of us, with what we have to
unravel
to
that.
make sense of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. I'm going to ask you about one of the podcasts that you mentioned, the email. In one of the podcasts, you were a host. You weren't the host. I think you were part of. You were, as you said, fired from when you interviewed a psychic medium against the host wishes. Can you tell us about that? And what was that? Which podcast was that? Was that more expressions?
Yeah. So the podcast was called Mormon Expression, and I did that. That was the first podcast that I really started on, and yeah, the host was very, very atheist leaning, and we just kind of butt heads a couple of times on like the kind of content that we were interested in doing.
Yeah.
At one point, there was a Mormon psychic and her husband who had reached out to that podcast asking to be interviewed, and none of them really wanted to do it, but they knew that I was interested in things like that and open to it. So they said, okay, Glenn, why don't you go ahead and interview him? You'll probably do better than the rest of us. Yeah. And I just really liked them, just like telling me their story and the things that she was claiming as a psychic. And she talked about this Kundalini experience that she had had. And I'd never heard the word Kundalini before. It was so funny sounding to me. Just, like everything about her experience talking to animals. Well, she, her husband made this joke that she's 5 for 5 on getting cats to pee in the litter box. So when people would come to him and say, my cat won't be in the litter box, and she'd talk to him, find out what's wrong. It just was so interesting to me. And so after I did this interview with her, I thought, wouldn't it be kind of cool if she would give me a reading and I could record that and have that be a podcast episode? And that was where,
that's where
the host of the podcast drew the line. No, don't do that.
Yep.
But I did it anyway. I was interested in doing it. And then that led to me being fired from the podcast. And so I started the Infants on Thrones in 2012 with those friends of mine. Yep. And the interview that I did with her, I never published the full interview, but I published most of it. Yeah. And then I did 2 or 3 other interviews with her that have also been published on Infants on Thrones. Her name is Krista Evans.
What was the response from Evans? What was the response from your audience on those podcasts?
Well, like I said, the audience was really a reflection of the hosts, and most of the hosts were atheist, very scientific minded, materialist, skeptic. And so it was kind of like, what are you doing, Glenn? Why are you giving voice to somebody who's making such crazy claims? Like, what is this all about? Why are you interested in this? And so I kind of have to defend myself why I was interested in it. But it didn't stop me. I still enjoyed it. I'm still friends with her today.
That's really cool. Yeah. So how did Bathing with God come about? And why in Bathing with God do you use quad? And explain to us, explain to the audience why, who quad is. Because I understand. But...
Quad is an amalgamation of the words quantum and God. So
there you go.
So the quantum energy, God, quad. And where did it come from? I started dating somebody who listened to Abraham Hicks. Mm-hmm. And I'd never heard of Abraham Hicks before, and we started listening to it. But I had read Seth Speaks and was very interested by Seth Speaks. Are you familiar with
No,
Seth Speaks?
Explain those.
Seth Speaks is there are probably 25 books of channeled material. A woman named Jane Roberts in the late 60s, early 70s was channeling this intelligence named Seth. And Seth talked about what it's like to be a disembodied source energy, basically. Mm-hmm. He doesn't ever use the word source energy, I don't think, but that's essentially the perspective that Seth is talking about. What's it like to exist outside of the realms of this earth? Mm-hmm. And it just it was so fascinating to me, just the ideas in that thing, whether you take it as literal or just a fiction, whatever you want. It's just, for me, has so many interesting ideas to just chew on. It's like a big buffet.
Mm.
And I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, for any of you or your listeners who are familiar with the Enneagram. I like big buffets.
Yeah.
I like a lot of options. And and then Abraham Hicks is a woman named Esther Hicks, who came across the Seth materials at some point in her life. And she started channeling this entity, Abraham. And Abraham is kind of like Seth in that way. And she does a lot of live events where people will come up and she'll have live interaction with them in the personality of Seth, or not Seth, of Abraham.
Yep.
And so I listened to those, and I really liked it. I thought it was fun. I like what she has to say.
Yeah.
And then a friend of mine recommended Neale Donald Walsch, Conversations with God, and I got that book and started listening to it. And I got maybe 45 minutes, an hour into the audiobook, and I thought, I like this idea. I like this format, but this isn't how I would write it. These aren't the questions that I would ask, and these aren't the answers that I would expect. And so just kind of like those three things, because I'm a creative person. I like to write. I like to produce. I turned that into my podcast hobby.
Yeah.
I started doing some Conversations with Quad instead of Conversations with God, the Neale Donald Walsch book. And I did a couple of episodes for Infants on Thrones a couple of years ago called Conversations with Quad, and had some pushback from a friend of mine, one of the co-hosts on the podcast, that really helped me to like, what do I really think? Where do these ideas fall flat? And where don't they? And it just turned into a thing where I would be sitting in my bathtub soaking and I would get some ideas and I would start writing them down on my phone in this format of question and answer, with myself posing questions and Quad as this personality that is basically playing the role that Seth did, or Abraham did, or God in Conversation with God. So that's, I've wanted to write a book for a long time, and I thought, oh, I'll do this one. I also I wanted to break away from with Infants on Thrones. We're coming up on 700 episodes over the last 8 years, and over 12 million,
a lot of episodes,
downloads total. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, but it's really changed, and I've changed from the time when I started it to doing it now. And I thought it'd be nice to do a podcast that doesn't have the same kind of baggage that,
or expectation,
I'm carrying around, your expectations, or reputation, or things like that. To do something different. I'll do Bathing with God. I'll have a book that's associated with it. So Bathing with God became the chapters of the book. Each chapter is a different episode of Bathing with God.
Yeah.
And then I also do listener mailbag questions when people will write in with their questions. And then I include interviews as well and things like that. So I think there's about 26 or 27 episodes of Bathing with God out right now. And I'm still doing Infants on Thrones. And I'm doing another podcast with a friend who's an astrologer that's a big Beatles fan. So we're doing the spiritual dimension of the Beatles. We've just started doing that. And
oh, wow. That excites me.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that excites me. So
really good.
Is that where the ayahuasca comes in? And how did you come to be wanting to do, and did you make the choice to want to do the ayahuasca journey, or was it something that just evolved and happened?
Well, I had never heard of ayahuasca. And a friend of mine, because I grew up Mormon, like you covered, I didn't drink. I didn't smoke.
Coffee was even frowned upon.
Yeah. I never did any kinds of drugs, anything like that, until my 40s. And when I didn't have the religious cultural reasons holding me back, I remembered stories that friends of mine had told me in high school about one guy in particular who did LSD and went and saw The Little Mermaid in the theater. And he's like, it was such a trip, Glenn. It was so awesome. He just was like talking it up so much that I'd always had this curiosity about psychedelics, but also a big fear around them. And so I was curious, and I thought I'll try mushrooms. And so I tried mushrooms with some friends of mine, and it was okay. I enjoyed listening to the music that I had. But I wrote down that experience, I recently went back and reread what I wrote from that experience, and it was actually more profound, as a tool for self-discovery than I gave it credit for at the time.
Yeah.
But it was shortly after that a friend of mine had said, well, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I know this shaman who gets this group together, and it's much more of a spiritual kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so if you're okay with that, why don't you come out and try it? And so I did. And I almost left after the first night.
Why was that?
Because it made me nervous. I was with a group of about 20 people who I didn't know.
Yeah.
I knew a couple of them, the friends of mine that invited me to it, but everyone else I didn't know. I wasn't sure about this shaman guy and what his agenda was. I wasn't sure if I could trust him.
Yeah.
I felt
that's a
like,
massive, that's a really big thing for this.
yeah. And I knew when I had taken the ayahuasca and sitting in the circle that I had put myself in a very vulnerable situation, that my mind was malleable.
Yeah.
And I was in a position where I could be being brainwashed. And so I thought, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to open myself up to being brainwashed? This could be a cult that I stumbled into. I don't know what this is. I had all of these fears that were going through my head that first night during that first experience. And I didn't take very much of it. I just kind of dipped my toe in, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the next day I was going to leave. And my friends, they said, well, why don't you stick it out? And, because if you leave, then you're kind of burning your bridges with this group and these people. And, there might be some people that you form some really good friendships with. And do you want to really let that go?
And also, more importantly, you didn't finish what I would consider the full experience. Like if you leave halfway through or leave with unanswered questions, that actually I think is more dangerous, or can be more dangerous than for the brain. And not, from what I understand of a shaman or a journey or a plant medicine experience, that if you leave that unfinished or unclosed, that can be dangerous going out into the world other than...
Maybe. I think it just would have become a completely different experience than the one that it did become. I really had a lot of resistance to the shaman telling me that I needed to go deeper, that I needed to face my fears, that I was allowing the shadow part of me to determine what I was doing. I thought, okay, I've heard propaganda before. I'm too smart for that. I'm not gonna let myself get brainwashed by this. But I did decide to stay for the second night, and I did decide because I saw other people that did go deep into the medicine, and they were fine the next day, and they had a fine experience. So I thought, okay, I'm here. I've made the journey to come out here because it wasn't close to where I live. It took quite a bit of effort to get there. I might as well do this. I came here to have this full experience. Let's just have the full experience, not the dip the toe in experience. And that second night was just super, super powerful. I asked questions about what the soul is, and I had a little vision of what a soul was, which doesn't make any sense to me, but it was kind of like a mandala or something like that. And I said, I don't understand. And the response was, you're not supposed to. And I saw different faces of like lives that I had lived supposedly in the past, and just like had all these kinds of experiences that became really meaningful. But it was mainly just the sense of love and connection that I felt to the people around me. And I had this really strong impression that there are parts of all of us who are just like this deep root system that is much deeper, and that we're all so connected in ways that just our egoic awareness, conscious awareness that you were talking about before the kangaroos came into yours, that we're just all connected. And the word that kept coming to me was conspiring, that we're like conspiring with each other on these levels and playing with each other on these levels that we don't really understand. So that experience definitely played an influence, and that was maybe a year or two before I started writing I started writing the Bathing with God stuff, the conversations with Quad. a few months after that.
Do you think
first
that had?
experience.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think that had an influence on bringing that out of you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because the way that I started thinking about things, it had been shifting for a long time anyway. But that, that experience definitely had an influence.
What do you think your purpose is, or what do you think your role here is in this plane? No, I know it's a really big question. I know, or I think I know what mine is, and I think that's to help people understand what their sole purpose is, and to bring them to, or help them on their journey to find awareness of what they are meant to do with life.
Well, let me tell you what I want it to be, Tanya. I want to be a bodhisattva. That's what I want to be.
What's it?
A bodhisattva, a being of love.
Yeah.
And that's an inward journey.
Yeah.
I've been so influenced recently by Michael Singer, the author of The Untethered Soul, who also did an 8-course series called The Path to Surrender.
God, so much I need to study. Yep.
Oh, well, I mean, this stuff from Michael Singer, and then another book by David Hawkins called Letting Go. Those I was reading as I was writing Bathing with God. And there are a lot of ideas in Bathing with God that came through those guys and those channels. Because so my purpose in life, the reason that I'm here, my focus, what keeps me going every day, is to release those false stories that I tell myself about what's going on in the world around me. And the areas where it's most influential, where I feel that impact the most, is in my relationships with people that I'm close to, that I live with. And when things happen that start to annoy me, and I can feel that fight or flight response happening in my brain, and things are constricting, and that tightness that you talked about earlier that you feel in your gut and your body.
Yeah.
To just kind of like remember, like breathe,
deeply
breathe, relax, relax, and recognize that my response to what's happening is my response to what's happening. That's the part that I'm responsible for.
And you talk about that as being your fiction, don't you?
Yeah, well, sure, it's a fiction. Yeah. I mean, all of these things. I think. I mean, if you want to talk about fictions, I
totally.
think that's all we really have to work with, because nobody has the complete picture of what's going on about anything.
No,
nobody does, and that's a really scary prospect. It's a really scary place to be. But to say, okay, well, what I think is true, I'm gonna own it as a fiction. This is my fiction. This is my story of what's going on. And as soon as I get better information, I'll update my story. I'll update the fiction. But I recognize there's always going to be, there's always much more out there that I don't know and possibly can't know than anything I do know. And that was one of my favorite parts to write at the end of chapter 1, when the bather is asking Quad, all right, well, how much do we know compared to how much we don't know? I like
that bit too. Yep.
It's like, well, there's no number for that, because if you assume that we're living in an infinitely expanding universe, then there are also, as a part of that infinite expansion, there are things that are being created that have never existed before, that
we don't have words for.
You don't have words for, but you can't create a percentage if the denominator is a constantly moving target.
Right.
It's constantly like, how would you give any kind of percentage on that? And so that was one of those little like insights that just came to me as a result of focusing to write this stuff, that I'm like, oh, thank you, Quad. I like having that perspective and recognizing, I can free myself of the fear of uncertainty by recognizing it's all, it's
okay.
It's
okay not to know everything.
It's okay not to know. And it's better to not pretend that we know.
I love that. Like when you just said there's fear around not knowing, and the infinite, I don't see that. For me, that's not fear. That's exciting, because there's so much more to learn.
Yeah.
But I can see where people come from when they say that they're fearful of that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you probably just one or two more questions. What are you excited about now? Like right now, what brings you joy?
Joy. Joy brings me joy.
Love.
I mean, there's love. just I going on walks, talking to friends, learning new things. I love it when I get questions from listeners of Bathing with God. And I just got one yesterday saying, what do you think about Jesus and gurus? And I'm like, ooh,
That's
okay.
a really good question.
That's a great question. How am I going to write this? Or what do you mean by an inner self? What's an inner self? And I'm like, oh, okay, this is a fun little nut I get to try and crack in my head.
Yeah.
And so taking the time out of my day to just sit down and start formulating a response to that, that's so much fun. I love doing that. And even when my partner and I get in little fights now, it's really interesting to watch how I change in the way that I respond, and the way that she changes in the way that she responds, as we're both becoming more aware of what's going on in those interactions,
in those games.
Yeah. And
are you able to
where
put
the
your
fear is coming from? Yeah.
Are you able to pull yourself out of that situation and look at it from the like second person, so you see how you're reacting in that situation?
You know what I've started doing? I mean, this is very, very recent, like within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've started telling myself, and not just in those moments, but kind of like reinforcing it at different times during the day. All I really have to give is love. All I have to give is love. And so in those moments where she's accusing me, like, you didn't do the dishes, you said you were going to do the dishes, or, something like that. And I'm like, but I did like, instead of getting defensive and feeling like there's a part of me that I have to defend, that's being attacked, I take that breath. I think, okay, all I have is love. Like, and what that has done is helped me see, okay, where she's coming from is she's really frustrated right now because the kitchen needs to be cleaned. So instead of wasting this time arguing about it, I show her that I love her by, okay, I'll go clean the kitchen. I'm not going to worry about what you're saying, if I did this or I didn't do that. I mean, these are just like little things that I can let go of. It's not important to the grand scheme of things. It's not important to me being a being of love, that I want to respond from a place of love as much as I possibly can, as often as I possibly can. So when I get those little victories where I can see, hey, I've done it, and like a month ago I wouldn't have, that's another thing that brings me a lot of joy.
Paul Chek, I'm a Chek practitioner, and Paul, who started the Chek Institute, says, the question you ask is, what would love do?
I like that.
I like that too.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, Tanya.
And if people want to find you, they can find you at Infants on Thrones, Bathing with God, and get the book.
Yeah. Bathing with God, and I love getting reviews and emails. I love getting emails from people who listen to it and asking questions and interacting. That's one of my favorite things about doing podcasting the way that I've been doing it, is the interaction with listeners.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for being here today, Glenn.
Thanks, Tanya.